Before I tell you what happened in the garden, I have to take you back to the water. Let the world grow quiet around you. Let the day loosen its grip, and let your breathing slow. This is the Shepherd's Bible. There was a town called Magdala. It sat low against the western shore of the lake, where the hills come down gently and then stop, as though they had thought better of going further. It was not a beautiful town. It smelled of fish and salt and wet rope, and of the tar they used on the hulls, and in the hot months it smelled of the drying sheds, which is a smell you never entirely lose from your clothes. But in the early morning, before the boats came in, before anyone was awake enough to speak, the lake would lie flat and pale as beaten silver, and the light would come over the far hills the color of the inside of a shell, and there was nothing more beautiful anywhere in the world. I am certain of that. I have seen other places since. I was born there. My name is Mary, which was the commonest name a girl could be given in those days. There were 4 of us on my street alone, so people called me by my town, Mary of Magdala, Mary the Magdalene. It is a small thing, being named after a place, but it means that wherever I have gone since, I have carried the lake with me. Let the town settle around you for a moment. The houses were black basalt, rough cut, the stones fitted without much care, and the roofs were flat, made of beams and reeds and packed mud, so that in the spring the roofs would sprout grass, and the whole town looked as though it were wearing a green cap. You slept on the roof in summer. Everyone did. You lay on your mat and looked up, and the stars came out one at a time, and then all at once, and you could hear your neighbors turning over, and a dog somewhere down by the harbor, and the water moving against the stones. That sound. Water against stone. Over and over. Patient, unhurried, saying nothing at all. There were nets everywhere, draped over walls, spread across the flat ground behind the houses, hung between poles to dry. The men mended them in the afternoons with wooden needles, sitting on their heels, talking about nothing, and their hands moved without them having to watch. Not pull, not pull. If you closed your eyes, you could hear the little tick of the needle going through, and the soft creak of the twine drawing tight. There were women at the well in the cool of the morning, and the rope over the stone lip had worn a groove in it deeper than your finger, worn by so many hands over so many years that the stone itself had given way, which tells you something about patience, and something about time. And there was me. I want to be careful here, because people have said many things about me over the years, and most of them were invented by people who never met me. They have made me into all sorts of women. Some of them made me wicked, because a wicked woman who is forgiven makes a better story than a sick woman who is healed, and people do love a story. But I am going to tell you the truth as plainly as I can, and the truth is that what was wrong with me was not wickedness. What was wrong with me was that I was not alone in my own body. I know how that sounds. I have had a long time to think about how to say it, and I have never found a good way. There is no clean word for it. In my language, we called it an evil spirit, a bad wind, and that is closer than anything, because it was like weather. It came in from somewhere else. It moved through me, and moved on, and came back, and you cannot argue with weather. You cannot reason with it, or apologize to it, or make it a meal to soften its mood. It simply arrives. There were 7 of them. I did not count them. I would not have known how. But he knew, and afterwards the others knew, and it was written down that way. And when I heard the number spoken aloud for the first time, I remember thinking, yes, that is right. 7. That is exactly how many I was. So the town by the water, the black stone houses, and the green roofs, the nets and the needles and the groove worn into the lip of the well. My father's boat, which was called nothing at all because he thought naming a boat was vanity, and which leaked at the stern seam every single year of its life, and every single year he swore it would be the last. Hold that town in your mind. Set it down by the water and leave it there. I was 20-something, as near as I can now put it. I had a house of my own by then, and money of my own, which was unusual for a woman, and both of those facts will matter later. And I was, by any measure that the town could apply, finished. That is where this begins. I will not frighten you. Let me tell you about the 7, the way I would tell it to someone half asleep, which is gently and without pressing. The first thing to know is that it did not feel like being invaded. It felt like being crowded. Imagine a small room, and imagine that the room is you, everything you are, all your thoughts and your preferences, and the particular way you hum when you are stirring something. Now imagine that 7 other people move into that room. They do not knock. They do not introduce themselves. They rearrange the furniture. They speak while you are speaking so that you cannot hear your own voice. And after long enough, you stop being sure which of the voices in the room was yours to begin with. That was the worst of it. Not the fear, the confusion. I could not find myself. I would reach for my own opinion about something, whether I was hungry, whether I liked someone, whether I wanted to go down to the water, and there would be nothing there, or there would be 7 answers, all of them loud, none of them mine. They each had their own character, or that is how I came to understand them. That sounds absurd, but anyone who has sat with a mind that is not obeying its owner will know something of what I mean. One of them was rage, and it came fast, and left me shaking and ashamed with my hands hurting. One was despair, and that one was heavy and slow and grey and did not shout at all. It simply sat on my chest and made everything pointless, and it was the one I feared most, because at least rage wanted something. It was a kind of terrible restlessness that would not let me sit or sleep or finish a sentence. One was silence. Days of it, when I could see people's mouths moving and could not make myself speak, could not, no matter how I strained, get one word up out of my throat. And there were others, and I will leave them be. I should say one thing plainly here, because somebody listening will need it said. I'm not telling you that everyone who has known despair has known what I knew. There are sicknesses of the mind that are sicknesses, and the people who carry them deserve care and gentleness and every help that can be found, and there is no shame anywhere in them. What was in me was other than me. It went out at a word, and it never came back. They came in turns, and sometimes together. I had good weeks. That was almost crueler than the bad ones, because in the good weeks I would begin to hope, and I would sweep the house and go to the well with the other women and stand in the light with my hair done and think, it has gone. It has finally gone. And then I would feel the first cold shift of it coming back, the way you feel a door open behind you, and I would know that I had another season of it to get through. People tried. I want that on the record, because it would be easy to make my neighbors into villains, and they were not villains, they were only afraid. My mother's sister prayed over me until her voice went. The men brought a healer from Tiberias who burned something bitter in a dish and told me to breathe it, and I breathed it, and I was sick for 2 days. Someone tied a written charm around my wrist. Someone said I should be taken to Jerusalem, and someone else said Jerusalem would not help, and they argued about it in my own front room as though I were a table they were deciding where to put. And then, one by one, they stopped coming. That is what I remember most clearly about those years. Not the fits, the gradual, courteous withdrawal of the whole world. People did not throw stones at me. It was politer And colder than that, they stopped calling my name across the street. They found reasons not to sit near me. They spoke about me in the third person while I was standing there, which is a thing people do to the sick everywhere, in every age, and I have never understood how they think we cannot hear it. I stopped going to the well in the morning and went at noon instead, when it was empty and the sun was hard and white on the stones. I stopped going to the assembly on the Sabbath because of what happened once, when the silence took me in the middle of the reading and everyone turned around. I stopped, in the end, going anywhere much at all. I sat inside with the door shut and the shutter open a hand's width, and I listened to the town going on without me, the nets and the needles and the voices at the well and the water against the stones. At night, I walked. That was the only thing that helped, and I did it for years. Out along the shore path, past the drying sheds, past the last of the houses, out to where there were tombs cut into the rock face, and nobody went after dark. I was not afraid of the tombs. I had stopped being afraid of anything outside myself. I would sit with my back against the cold stone and look at the lake, and the lake would be black with a long broken road of moonlight on it, and I would say to whatever was in me, "What do you want? What do you want? Tell me what you want, and I will give it to you, and you can go." And there was never any answer, because that was not the kind of thing they were. They did not want. They only occupied. There is one more thing, and then I will let this chapter close. Every so often, on those walks, in the middle of all of it, there would come a moment, no longer than a breath, when the room was empty, when they were all, for some reason, looking the other way. And in that gap, I would feel myself, the whole of myself, present and quiet and intact, the way you might catch sight of your own face in still water. And I would think, with an ache I cannot describe to you, there I am. That is who I am. She is still in here. Those moments were a kind of torture, because they never lasted. But they were also, I understand now, the only thing that kept me alive, because they told me there was someone in there worth saving. Hold on to that, if you take nothing else from tonight. Even at the very bottom, something in me knew my own name. He came to Magdala in the spring. I did not see him arrive. I heard about it the way I heard about everything then, in pieces through the shutter. The girl who brought my flour said there was a teacher from Nazareth down by the harbor, and that he had said something about the fishing that made the men laugh, and that a woman from the next street had brought her son to him, and the boy's arm had straightened out. I did not go. I want to be honest about that. I had been to healers. I had been breathed over and prayed at, and had bitter smoke waved in my face, and every one of those times I had walked home in the dark, knowing that it had failed, and that everyone had watched it fail. Hope had become a thing that cost me too much. So I stayed in. He came anyway, not to my door. Nothing so dramatic. It was 3 days later, and the 7 had been bad, very bad. The worst it had been in a long while, and I had gone out at first light because I could not stay in the house another hour. I went the shore way, past the sheds, and I was not thinking about anything. I remember the sound of my own feet on the shingle. I remember that the lake was completely still. There were people up ahead on the strand, 20, 30 of them, sitting on the stones the way people sit when they have been listening a long time. And in front of them, at the water's edge, a man was talking. He had his back half to me. He was not loud. That is the first thing I noticed, and I have never stopped noticing it. He was not loud. He was talking the way you talk to people who are already listening. I stopped where I was, perhaps 40 paces off, and I had every intention of going around. Then he turned his head and looked at me. "I need you to understand," that nothing happened in that moment. There was no light, no wind, no voice from heaven, nothing that anyone else on that beach would have been able to see. He simply stopped speaking mid-sentence and looked up at a woman standing on the path, and the look went all the way in. That was what undid me. Not power, recognition. Everyone in Magdala looked at me and saw the thing that lived in me. For years and years, that was all anybody saw. They looked at me, and their eyes went slightly wrong, slightly sideways, the way you look at something you would rather not see clearly. And he looked at me, and I could tell immediately that he was not looking at the 7. He was looking past them, at the woman in the room, at the one I only ever caught sight of for half a breath at a time. He looked straight at her, as though she had been standing there in plain view the whole time, as though he could not imagine how the rest of them had missed her. And then they knew they were finished. That is the only way I can put it. The 7 understood before I did. Everything in me convulsed at once, all of them together, which had never happened, all 7 awake and screaming, and my legs went, and I was on the stones. I will not describe the next part in detail, and here is why. Because it was the last time, and because what I want you to remember about it is not the noise. What I remember is this. He came up the beach. He did not hurry, and he did not shout. I had braced for shouting. Every healer shouts. They think volume is authority. He knelt down on the stones beside me, and as I remember it, he put one hand on the side of my head quite lightly, the way you would settle a frightened animal, and he said something short. I have been asked 1,000 times what he said. I do not know. I was not able to hold on to it. But I do know that between his hand touching my head and the next thing I was aware of, there was no struggle at all. There was no fight. 7 of them. Years of them. Generations of noise. And it was over in less time than it takes to pour a cup of water. Which is when I understood something that has stayed with me ever since. All that time, I had thought I was up against something enormous. And it turned out that what I was up against was not enormous at all. It had only been bigger than me. Then, quiet. I want to hold here a while, because this is the part that people always rush past, and it was the whole of my life. I was lying on wet shingle with my cheek on the stones. I could feel individual pebbles pressing into my face, and the cold coming up through my shoulder and small waves arriving a few feet away, one after another. Hush, hush, hush. And in me, there was nothing, not emptiness. I do not want you to hear the wrong thing. Not a hollow room. Base. The whole room. Swept and open and full of light, and one person standing in it. Me. Only me. I lay on those stones and I listened to my own mind the way you would listen at the door of an empty house. And it was quiet in there. It was so quiet. I could hear one thought at a time, arriving alone, moving at the speed I chose. I could hear that I was cold. I could hear that my mouth tasted of salt. I could hear, underneath everything, my own heart going about its business, unhurried, ordinary mine. Somebody put a cloak over me. Somebody's hand was under my head. And then I heard him say the one thing I did hold on to, the one thing I have never lost. He said my name. Not woman. Not daughter. Not the town. He said Mary. And there was nothing in it but kindness, and no fear at all, and I lay there on the cold stones of my own beach in my own town, and wept like something being born. Because for the first time in my adult life, somebody had spoken my name and the right person had answered. Nobody tells you how strange it is to be well. I'd spent so long being ill, that being ill was the shape my life had grown into. the way a tree grows around a wall. And then the wall was gone, and I did not know what shape to be. They took me back to my house. 2 women I barely knew, holding me up on either side. I remember standing in my own doorway and not being able to go in, because the house was full of the smell of the years I had spent in it, and I could not bear it. So we sat outside on the step, and one of the women went in and opened all the shutters, every one of them, and threw a jug of water across the floor and swept it out, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in a decade. And she did not say a word about why. That first day, I was useless. I sat on the step and looked at things. I looked at the wall opposite for a long time. It was a good wall. It had a crack near the bottom in the shape of a river with 2 branches, and I had never once noticed it in all the years I had lived there, because you cannot notice a wall when there are 7 people shouting in your head. That is what the first weeks were, noticing the taste of bread. I sat down to a piece of barley bread and honey, and I had to stop because I could taste it, all of it, the sourness underneath and the grit of the flour, and the honey going over the top of it like light coming over a hill, and I had not properly tasted food in years. Food had been fuel, taken quickly in the gaps. The weight of a full water jar on my hip, and the way you have to lean against it. The smell of the lake in the evening as it cools, which is quite different from the smell of it in the morning. The particular pleasure of putting your feet in cold water at the end of a hot day. Children arguing, somebody's goat getting out, and 4 people trying to catch it and everybody laughing. Small things. All of it. Small things. That is what wellness turned out to be. Not a great blaze of joy. I had expected a blaze, and there was one, on that first day, and it burned off by evening the way a blaze does. What was left underneath, and what stayed, was smaller and steadier and infinitely better. It was the plain, unremarkable pleasure of being a woman in a town by a lake, doing ordinary things in her own right mind. And then there was sleeping. I had not slept properly in years. Sleep had been something that happened to me by ambush, in fragments, and it was never restful, and I always woke into the middle of the noise as though I had never left. So on the second night, when the woman came back to sit with me, and I lay down on my mat with the shutters open and the sound of the water coming in, I was frightened. I said so. I said, I do not know how to do this. And the woman sitting with me, whose name was Joanna, and you will hear more about her, said, then don't do it. Just lie there. So I lay there, and the water went hush against the stones, and the town went quiet by degrees. First the voices, then the doors, then the last dog, and there was nothing in my mind at all, except the sound of the lake, and the shape of the window, and the fact that I was warm. I remember thinking quite clearly, if it comes back tonight, at least I had this. And then it was morning. I cannot tell you what that was. To close your eyes in the dark and open them in the light, and to have crossed the whole of the night without knowing anything about it. To wake up and lie still for a moment and feel your own body all around you, unoccupied, whole, rested. It is the most ordinary miracle there is. Everybody in the world does it every night. I had it back after 10 years, and I lay on my mat that morning with the light coming grey through the window, and I did not move for a long time in case it broke. I have thought since that this is what he did wherever he went. Everyone remembers the storms and the loaves and the dead getting up, and those things happened. I was there for some of them. But most of what he did was quieter than that, and harder to write down. Most of what he did was give people back their own lives, their sleep, their taste, their name, the ability to sit on a step and notice a crack in a wall. On the 4th day, Joanna and another woman, Susanna, older, with hands like a fisherman's and no patience at all for self-pity, sat me down in the yard and washed my hair. That is such a small thing to have remembered for so long. But my hair had been a matted, neglected, shameful thing for years, and they got warm water and oil, and they worked through it a section at a time, all afternoon, saying almost nothing. Susanna hummed. Joanna's fingers were very gentle at the roots, and when they had finished, they combed it out, and it lay down my back nearly to my waist, clean and heavy, and smelling of nothing but water. I could not stop touching it. And Susanna, who had watched me touching it for about as long as she could stand, said, "Well, there you are. There you are. Yes, there I was." He left Magdala about 2 weeks later, going up through the villages, Chorazin, Bethsaida, inland to the little places in the hills that nobody visits. Word went round that he was leaving in the morning, and I sat in my house that night and had the first real argument of my new life, which was with myself, because here is the thing nobody had said out loud. I was well, wonderfully, unbelievably well, and I was also, in that town, unemployable, unmarriageable, and permanently known. Magdala had made up its mind about me years ago. People were kind now, kinder than before, but they were kind the way you are kind to something that might break. They watched me. When I laughed too suddenly at something, I saw two of them glance at each other. I was going to spend the rest of my life in that town being the woman it had happened to. And there was something else, which I am almost embarrassed to tell you because it is not lofty. I did not want to be away from him, not in the way the songs have made it since. I have heard what people say, and it is not that. It was never that. It was this. He was the only person alive who, when he looked at me, did not see the seven. Everyone else in the world, my aunt, my neighbors, the girl who brought my flour, even Joanna a little, everyone else looked at me and saw a woman who had been possessed. He looked at me and saw Mary. And when you have been unseen for 10 years, being seen properly is not a preference. It is water. So, in the morning, I went down to the road with a bundle. There were already women there. That surprised me, and it should not have. Joanna was one of them, and she was not a poor woman making a poor woman's choice. Her husband, Chooser, was Herod's own steward, and I never fully understood what that cost her, and she never once discussed it. Susanna was there, with a bag half the size of mine, and twice as well packed, and there were others, and more joined later, and some came and went. We were not a curiosity. I want to say that clearly, because it has been misunderstood. We were a working part of it. Somebody had to buy the flour. Somebody had to know which houses in which village would take 15 people for a night, and which wells were sweet and which were brackish, and how to make lentils stretch, and what to do when one of the men wore his sandal through on the second day of a 5-day walk. When it was written down afterwards, it was put very simply, that certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities traveled with him, and that we served them out of our own possessions. And I have always thought that was a fair account, though it makes it sound tidier than it was. Out of our own possessions. Yes, I sold the house near the harbor, not the one I lived in. That took me longer, and I kept it a full year, telling myself it was sensible, and it was not sensible. It was a rope I was holding in case I needed to pull myself back. I let it go the following spring. I gave the money to Judas, who kept the purse in those days, and I signed away the last thing that made me a woman of standing anywhere. I have been asked whether that was hard. It was not hard at all, and I have never been able to make people believe me, understand what I was trading. I was trading a black stone house with a leaking roof and a lifetime of being pitied politely for the open road with people who did not flinch when I laughed. The first night on the road, we stopped short of the village because one of the older men was struggling, and we slept out. I remember lying on the ground with my cloak over me, and the fire going down to embers, and the enormous silence of the hills, so much bigger than the silence of a room. Someone was snoring. Someone else was quietly telling someone else that they were snoring, and I lay on my back and looked straight up into more stars than I had ever seen from a rooftop. And I put my hands flat on the earth on either side of me, and I thought, 2 months ago, I was sitting in the dark with the shutter open a hand's width, listening to other people's lives. That is all. That was the whole thought. But I have had it 100 times since, in 100 places, and it never wears out. I did not know then how long we had. Nobody did. If you had told me on that first night that I had perhaps 2.5 years, that I would walk these roads for 2.5 years, and then stand on a hill outside Jerusalem and watch what I watched, I do not know what I would have done. Gone home, possibly. Sat back down in the dark. I am glad nobody told me. You are not given the whole road at once. You are given the next bit of it, and the next, and it is enough. And afterwards you look back and see that you walked further than you thought you could. So let me take you along it. There is time. The night is long, and we are going the same way anyway. I have been asked what those years were like, and people always want the wonders. I will come to the wonders. But if you want to know what it was actually like, it was walking. We walked. That is the honest answer. Galilee is not large. You can cross the whole of it in 3 days if you are determined, and nobody's feet give out. But we crossed it and recrossed it and doubled back and went round again, and by the end I knew those roads the way you know the inside of your own house in the dark. Let me give you the shape of a day, because it was nearly always the same shape, and there is something restful in that. We rose early, always before the sun, because the first 2 hours of walking are worth 4 of the afternoon ones. There would be bread from the night before, gone hard, which you dipped in oil or in a little sour wine to soften it. Nobody talked much. Morning people and evening people are different creatures, and we had both. And the arrangement was that the morning people did not speak to the evening people until the sun was properly up. Peter was an evening person. Peter was fearsome in the mornings, and everyone knew it, and it became a joke, and eventually he made the joke himself. Then the road. Dust. You cannot imagine the dust unless you have walked a Galilean track in the dry months. It goes grey up your legs to the knee and into your hair, and you taste it at the back of your throat all day. You walk with your head slightly down. You watch the heels of the person in front of you. The stones are not laid. They are simply the stones that have been walked flat by everyone who came before, and there is a particular ache that starts in the arch of your foot around mid-morning and then, oddly, goes away again if you keep going. The land changes as you go. Down by the lake it is green and generous, with black soil and fig trees and the reed beds at the water's edge full of small birds arguing. Go inland and up, and it dries out. The hills are pale and stony and terraced with walls that somebody's great-grandfather built, and the olives grow silver-grey and twisted, and there are long stretches where the only sound is your own party and the wind, and the occasional bell from a flock you cannot see. And I want to give you this properly, because I want you to have it. In the spring, after the rains, the whole of Galilee flowers. All of it. Those pale stony hills come out in red and yellow and blue for about 3 weeks. Anemones and mustard and flax and the little white ones that close up at night, so thick in places that you cannot walk without, treading on them. He loved it. He used to talk about it. He said once, standing on a slope somewhere above Nazareth with all that color running away downhill from us, that not even Solomon in his best robes was dressed like that. And then he said, mostly to a couple of the anxious ones, that if God bothers to dress a hillside that well for 3 weeks, they might stop lying awake about their clothes. We would come to a village around the middle of the morning. You could tell what sort of welcome we would get within about a minute. Sometimes there were people already waiting on the road because word had run ahead of us, and there would be a crowd before we had even reached the houses, and the sick would be brought out on mats and doors and in their brothers' arms, and that day would be entirely swallowed by it, and we would not eat until dark. Other times, we would walk into a silent square with the shutters closing as we came, and we would fill our skins at the well and walk out the other side and say nothing about it. We carried salt, oil, lentils, dried fish, and a small stone of hard cheese that lasted improbably long. We patched cloaks. I mended more sandals than I can count, sitting in the dust with an awl and a length of thong, and I got quick at it, and the men brought them to me the way you bring things to someone who is good at them. Twice, I sat up all night with someone's fever in a village where we knew nobody. That is not in anybody's account of those years, and I am not troubled by that. It happened. It counted. And in the evenings, when the day was over and the crowd had gone home and there were 15 or 20 of us round a fire in somebody's yard, he would talk. Not teaching, exactly. Just talking. That was when the best of it came out. Someone would ask him a question, usually a stupid question, and he never once made anyone feel stupid for asking it, and he would think about it for a moment, looking into the fire. And then he would start a story about a farmer, or a woman who had lost a coin, or a man with 2 sons, and everyone would go quiet, and the fire would tick, and somewhere out in the dark the sheep would be moving. I want you to notice something about that. He talked about work, sewing, baking, fishing, sweeping, keeping accounts, minding sheep, mending. Everything he said about God, he said in the language of people who were tired at the end of the day. He never once made the holy thing sound like it lived somewhere else. There was a dinner I've never forgotten, and it was not my dinner and not my moment, and it changed me more than most of the things that happened to me directly. We were in a town, and I will not say which, because it does not matter, and a Pharisee named Simon invited him to eat. That happened sometimes. Not all of them were hostile. Some were curious. Some wanted to test him in front of company, and some, I think, genuinely wanted to know. It was a proper meal, the formal kind, with the low tables in a square and cushions, and everyone reclining on their left side with their feet out behind them, which is how the wealthy ate then. The courtyard was open to the street on one side, as they were, so passers-by could look in and hang about the edges and watch the important people eat. That is normal. Everyone did it. There is no privacy in a courtyard. I was at the back with the other women, near the wall, where we could be useful and out of the way, and a woman came in off the street. I did not know her. I never learned her name. And I've thought about that a great deal over the years, that the whole world knows what she did, and nobody knows what she was called. She was not one of us. She was a woman of that town. And from the way the room moved when she came in, everyone in it knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was, and none of it was good. The room went still in that particular way. I knew that stillness. I had walked into it in Magdala 100 times. There is a specific quality to a silence that is about you, and it lands on the skin like cold water, and you never get used to it. She had an alabaster jar. She came in behind him where he was reclining so his feet were towards her, and she stood there. And this is the part I remember best, because it went on so long. She stood there and could not begin. Everyone watching. Simon halfway to his feet, deciding whether to have her put out. And she stood with that jar in both hands and her whole body shaking, and then she simply stopped trying to hold it in and wept. Not quietly. She wept so hard she could not stand. And she went down at his feet, and her tears fell on them. His actual feet, dusty from the road, because Simon had not offered him water, which I had noticed, and which every woman in that room had noticed. And then she did a thing so shocking that people in that courtyard were still talking about it years later. She let down her hair in a room full of men, and she used her own hair to wipe his feet, and she kissed them over and over, and she broke the neck of the jar and poured the ointment out. The smell filled the whole courtyard in a few seconds. Lord, I think it went everywhere. It was the smell of a great deal of money and a great deal of shame being poured out on the floor. And I stood against that wall, and I have to use the right word, I was jealous. That is the truth, and I have never dressed it up. I was jealous of her because she had done it, and I had not. Because in 2 years of walking behind that man, I had washed his cloak and cooked his food and mended his sandals, and I had never once found a way to say what she said in about 90 seconds with a jar in her own hair. There is a kind of love that will make itself ridiculous in public, and she had it, and I was still keeping mine folded up and useful. Simon said what Simon was always going to say. He said it to himself, but in the way people say things to themselves at dinner, audibly. If this man were a prophet, he would know what sort of woman this is. And he answered him gently, which was worse for Simon than anger would have been. He told him a small story about 2 debtors, one who owed a great deal and one who owed little, and both let off, and he asked which of them would love the lender more. Simon gave the obvious answer because it was obvious, and I watched him realize as he was saying it that he had just walked into something. Then he turned round. He turned all the way round to look at the woman on the floor, and he said to Simon, though he was looking at her the whole time, "Do you see this woman? I have heard sermons on that dinner. I have heard people argue about the debt and the ointment and the difference between one gospel's account and another's. And every time I want to stand up and say, it was those 4 words. Do you see this woman? Because nobody in that courtyard had seen her. They had seen her reputation walk in, wearing her body. And he made the richest man in the room look at her, actually look, and say what he saw. And then he listed it. That is what undid me. He listed the things she had done, as though they were an honor roll. You gave me no water for my feet. She has washed them with her tears. You gave me no kiss. She has not stopped kissing my feet since I came in. You did not anoint my head. She has anointed my feet with ointment. Every discourtesy of Simon's set against every extravagance of hers. Therefore I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But one to whom little is forgiven loves little. And then to her, directly, as if the rest of us were not there, your sins are forgiven. Your faith has saved you. Go in peace. She went out through the same street she had come in from, and I have no idea what became of her, and I hope with all my heart that the town let her be somebody new. I lay awake that night, and what I decided, lying awake in a strange yard with the smell of that nard still faintly in my clothes, was this, that I would not be the one who stood against the wall again, that when my turn came to make a fool of myself over him, I would take it. I did not know that my turn would come with a jar of spices in the dark, at a tomb, on the far side of everything, but I kept the promise. I want that noted. When it came, I kept it. There were 2 days that spring that I have always kept side by side in my mind, because they happened one after the other, and because together they taught me the only theology I have ever been sure of. The first was the crossing. We went out in the evening from the western shore, which is a thing local men do not do lightly, and half our number were local men, so there was some muttering. He wanted to go over to the far side, the Gadarene country, which is Greek country, pig country, not our sort of place at all. So we went. 2 boats. I was in the second. If you have never been on that lake, you need to know that it does not behave like other water. It sits low, 700 feet below the sea, with hills all round it, and the wind comes down off the heights through the gaps in the hills like water out of a jug. It can be glass at sunset, and a fury by full dark. The men who fished it all their lives still got caught, and they knew it. And that is why they mutter when a carpenter says, "Let us go across in the evening." It came down on us, about halfway. Black water and white tops. The boat going up and slapping down so hard your teeth met. Water coming in over the side in sheets. Not spray. Sheets. So much of it that 2 men were bailing with their hands and their hats, and it was doing nothing. Everyone shouting, and the shouting not helping. And he was asleep. I was not in his boat, so I have this from the ones who were, and they told it so often and with such indignation that I might as well have been. He was asleep in the stern with his head on the leather cushion they kept back there, and the boat was filling, and he did not wake, and they had to shake him. And Peter, it was Peter, of course it was Peter, shouted into his face, "Master, Master, we are dying." He got up. He looked at it, and he spoke to the weather, the way you speak to a dog that is barking at a friend. The men said the wind stopped first, all at once, like a door closing. Then the water went down, which is the part nobody who has not been at sea can properly appreciate, because wind can drop in a moment, that happens, but the sea keeps running for an hour after. Not that night. It went flat, from white tops to a black mirror with all our lanterns doubled in it, and the only sound the water in the bottom of the boat sloshing about with nowhere to go. Nobody cheered. That is what I remember from my own boat. The silence coming across the water. 12 grown men who fished for a living, standing knee-deep in their own bilge, saying absolutely nothing. Then somebody said, "Who is this?" And that was the only sensible thing anybody said all night. Now the second day, which was the morning after, and which is mine, we came ashore on the eastern side in the grey before dawn, wet through and no one having slept. It is a bleak coast there, steep, stony, and there were tombs cut into the rock face above the beach. And a man came down out of the tombs. I want to tell this carefully, because when the others tell it, they tell the pigs, and the pigs are a good story and they are welcome to it. What I saw was something else. He was naked. He had been for years, they said afterwards. He was cut all over, old cuts and new ones, his own doing, because that was one of the things it made him do. There were broken chains on his wrists, and iron on one ankle with the links snapped off short, because the town had tried more than once to hold him, and he had come out of everything they put on him. He lived up there among the graves, and he cried out at night, and the whole district could hear him, and nobody went up. And I stood on the shingle with my wet cloak stuck to me, and I looked at that man coming down the slope, and every hair on my body stood up. Not because I was afraid of him, because I knew him. Do you understand what I am telling you? I looked at that man, and I saw the shore path outside Magdala, and the cold stone at my back, and myself sitting among the tombs at night, because it was the only place left where nobody would look at me sideways. I saw the thing I had been 3 years earlier, and I saw what I would have gone on to become if nobody had come across the water. The chains were the only difference between us. and they were not much of a difference. Magdala had used politeness where his town had used iron. But it comes to the same thing in the end. You end up on the hill with the dead. He went to meet him, alone, up the slope. He asked it its name, and it said Legion, for we are many. And I heard that from where I stood, and something in me went cold and level, because I knew that voice, not the man's voice, the other one, the flat one that comes out of a mouth that is not being used by its owner. I had made that sound in my own house, in my own throat. I had heard my mother's sister flinch at it. Then the pigs, and the noise of it, and the men who kept them running for the town. And then this, which is the reason I have told you any of it. When the townspeople came out, a whole crowd of them, furious about the herd, ready to be furious about everything, they came up the shore expecting the madman on the hill. And he was sitting at his feet, clothed, because somebody had given him something. I think it was one of ours, sitting on the ground with his back straight and his hands still, listening to something being said to him and answering it, not raving, answering in his right mind. And they were terrified. That is the detail that nobody explains and that I understood instantly. They were not glad. They were frightened, and they asked him to leave, and we got back in the boats before the day was properly warm and went home. Because a raving man on a hill is a problem. You know the shape of. You can keep him at a distance. You can agree about him at the well. But a man who has come back, a man who is sitting there clothed and quiet and looking at you and might, at any moment, ask you where you were for the last 9 years, that is not a problem. That is an accusation. It is much easier to have us out on the hill. I know. I was on the hill. He wanted to come with us. He begged, they said. He wanted in the boat, and he would not let him. He told him to go home instead, back into that town that had chained him and given up on him, and tell them what had been done for him. I thought that was cruel at the time. I have thought about it every year since, and I do not think it was cruel at all. I think he was the only one who could go back into that town and make it impossible for them to go on pretending. And I think, though this is only mine, and I have no authority for it, that he knew the man needed to be somebody's neighbor again, not somebody's follower, that there is a healing that only happens when you walk back in through the gate you were dragged out of. I did not do that. I went with the boats. Not everyone is asked for the same thing, but I have wondered all my life what that town looked like 10 years on, whether he mended nets, whether he married, whether children who had been told all their lives to stay away from the tombs grew up knowing a quiet man in the street and never knew that about him at all. I want to spend a little while on the small things, because the small things are what I actually have. Nobody writes down an ordinary afternoon, but there were hundreds of ordinary afternoons, and they were the best of my life. And if you are drifting off now, then this is a good chapter to drift in. He was not tall. People are always surprised by that. He was of middling height and quite strong through the shoulders and forearms, the way a man is who has been working wood since he was 7, and he had a workman's hands, square, marked, with a thumbnail that had been split at some point and never grew back straight. I noticed that thumbnail more than I noticed anything else about his appearance. It was the most human thing about him. He walked fast, faster than was comfortable, honestly, and he did not always notice that he had left people behind. He was often the first up in the mornings, and he was frequently not there at all when you woke, because he had gone off in the dark to some hillside on his own, and he would come back down as we were eating with dust on his cloak and not explain where he had been. We learned not to ask. We also learned to leave him bread. He got tired. I want to say that plainly because people have made him into something made of light, and it robs him of the thing that mattered most. He got tired. I have seen him fall asleep sitting up with his back against a wall in the middle of a conversation. I have seen him so worn out by a day of people that he could not manage a sentence, and one of the men would say, "Enough now, let him eat," and we would put a bowl in his hands, and everybody would look at the fire and let him be. He was funny. This is the thing that has been lost most completely, and it grieves me. He was properly funny, dry, and quick, and often mischievous. A great deal of what he said was funnier out loud than it looks written down. Camels going through the eyes of needles. A man with a plank in his own eye, offering to get a speck out of yours. Straining a gnat out of your wine, and then swallowing a camel whole. People laughed. Crowds laughed. It was one of the reasons they stayed to listen in the sun for 3 hours. And if you take the laughing out, you cannot explain the crowds. He was easy with children, in a way that men of that time simply were not. Children came to him the way cats go to the one person in the room who is not interested. Except he was interested. That was the difference. He would stop for them. In the middle of important men talking, he would stop and squat down and give a child his whole attention, and the important men would have to wait. And once the men tried to move them along, they thought they were protecting him. They were always trying to protect him from ordinary people, and he lost his temper about it. Not much, but enough that they remembered it. He asked questions all the time, constantly, and not rhetorically. What do you want? Who touched me? What are you arguing about? Do you believe I can do this? Who do you say I am? He would ask a question, and then wait, and he was extremely comfortable with silence, and most people are not, and so they would fill it, and in filling it, they would say the true thing they had come to say. I watched him do that to hundreds of people. I watched him do it to me. He never once, in all the time I knew him, referred to my illness in front of others. I do not know if you can feel the weight of that. Every other person I met for the rest of my life found a way to mention it. Even the kind ones, even the ones who loved me. It came up. Mary, who was, you know, because it was the most interesting fact about me. And people cannot help themselves. He knew more about what had been in me than anyone alive, and he never used it. Not as an example, not as a testimony, not once. When he sent us out, he sent me on my own merits. When he wanted something done, he asked me to do it as a woman who could do things. That is what love is, incidentally. I did not know it at the time. I thought love was the big feelings. Love is somebody having the whole account of you and choosing, every day, which pages to leave closed. There is one more, and it is the smallest thing in this whole story. There was an evening, late in the second year, somewhere in the hills, nothing happening, and I was sitting a little apart mending something, and it was getting too dark to see the stitches, and I was thinking about my mother, who had died while I was ill, and whom I had been too ill to properly grieve. I had not said anything about it. I had not said anything about it for 8 years, and he came and sat down on the wall next to me, and he did not ask what was wrong. He sat there for a while, looking out at the same hills I was looking at, and then he said, "Tell me about her." I talked until the fire was embers. He did not say anything wise at the end of it. He did not explain anything or make it mean anything. He just listened to the whole of it. And then he said her name back to me once, out loud, the way you set something down carefully on a shelf where it will be safe. That was how those years went. One ordinary evening after another, and I thought there would always be more of them. It changed in the last spring. I felt it before I understood it, the way you feel weather. We had been north, right up out of Galilee, out of the country, into the Greek towns near Caesarea where nobody knew him, and he could walk down a street unrecognized, which I think was the point. He seemed to want a few weeks where nobody needed anything from him, and it was there, up in that cool green country under the mountain, that he asked them the question I mentioned, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter answered it. And something in the whole enterprise turned over and set in a new direction, because from then on he talked about Jerusalem. He had always gone up for the feasts, as any observant man did. This was different. He began to talk about going up as though it were the end of something. And when he talked about it, he said things that made the men go quiet and change the subject. That he would be handed over, that he would suffer, that he would be killed and rise on the third day. I want to be honest about how we heard that, because there has been a great deal of pretense about it since. We did not understand it, not one of us. I have heard people say that we should have, that he had told us plainly, and we were simply slow, and there is something in that, but it is not the whole truth. The truth is that when someone you love tells you they're going to die, your mind does something clever and merciful with the information. It files. It's somewhere else. You hear it, and you nod, and then you go on packing the bread as though the sentence had not been said, because to actually receive it would stop your hands. And there was the third day. He always said the third day, and that part was so impossible that it made the whole statement feel like one of his stories, a hard saying, a thing meant sideways, something we would understand later. So he took it as a parable, and we were relieved to. We went up in the spring for Passover. You have to understand what going up to Jerusalem was. It is not a figure of speech. You climb. From the lake you go up and up through the Jordan Valley and then out of it. And the last stretch from Jericho is 15 miles of ascent through a wilderness the color of bone, and it takes most of a day. And the pilgrim roads in that season are packed. Whole villages moving together. Grandmothers on donkeys, boys running the flocks of lambs up the road, and the lambs bleating and stopping, and the boys losing their tempers, and everybody having to walk around them. They sing on that road. That is the thing I would want you to hear, if you could hear only one thing. There are songs for the going up. Everybody knows them. You learn them as a child, and they pass back and forth along the column, one group starting and another answering half a mile behind, all day long, in the heat, up the hill. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. Our feet shall stand within your gates, Jerusalem. Thousands of people singing the same thing in ragged relay for 15 miles. I loved it. I loved it so much that year that I remember thinking I ought to be careful because nothing is allowed to be that good for long. And then the city. You come round a shoulder of the Mount of Olives, and it is suddenly there below you, across the valley, the whole of it, walls the color of honey in the late sun, and the temple standing up out of the middle of it, in white stone and gold. And it is enormous. It is the biggest thing you have ever seen made by hands, and it takes the breath out of every single pilgrim on that road every single year. People sit down. People weep. Old men who have done it 40 times stand there with their mouths open. We stopped there, in the crowd, and I looked at all that gold, and then I looked at him. He was crying, not the way the pilgrims were crying. He was looking at that city, and his face was wet, and there was nothing joyful in it at all. And I remember taking one step towards him, and then not taking another, because whatever that was, it was not something I could help with. I did not understand it for another week. Then I understood it completely. The days after that ran very fast, the way the water runs fast at the top of a fall, while the surface still looks calm. Crowds in the streets, palm branches and shouting, and people spreading their cloaks in the road, and for 2 days it looked like triumph. Then the temple, and the tables over, and the coins going everywhere across the pavement, and the noise, and the faces of the men in the porticos watching him. I saw those faces. Anyone would have known. He taught every day that week in the temple courts, and the crowds were so thick they could not arrest him in daylight, and everybody on both sides knew that too. It was a week of held breath. On the Wednesday, Joanna came to find me in the evening and sat down beside me and said, quietly, that her husband had heard something. She did not know what, but something had been decided. We were staying out at Bethany, over the hill, a couple of miles off, because there was no room in the city and because it was safer. I lay awake on the roof that night, with the noise of 100,000 pilgrims coming over the hill from the city, and I thought about the shore at Magdala, and the way his hand had felt on the side of my head, and I prayed the only prayer I had left, which was not a good prayer, and which I have never repeated. I said, "Please, not yet. I have only just started. I am going to tell the next part quietly. There is a way of telling it that is all noise and blood, and it has been told that way many times, and I understand why. But I was there, and I do not remember it as noise. Remember it as a very long stillness, with terrible things happening at the edges of it, and that is how I am going to give it to you. If you are near sleep now, you can stay near sleep. I will not startle you. Nothing in the next hour will be loud." On the Thursday, the men went into the city to eat the Passover, and we did not go with them. That has been asked about, and the answer is dull. It was a room that had been arranged. It held what it held, and the arrangement was his. We had made a great deal of the preparation earlier in the day, the bitter herbs, the unleavened bread, the bowls, and then we went back over the hill to the house at Bethany where we were staying. And the men went to the upper room, and that was the last ordinary parting of my life. I do not remember saying anything to him. I have tried and tried to remember, and there is nothing there. It was probably something about bread. That is worth knowing, and I have found it a comfort rather than otherwise. You do not get to choose your last ordinary words with anyone. They are nearly always about bread. It does not mean the love was not there. It means the love was so ordinary by then that it did not need saying, which is its own kind of achievement. We sat up at Bethany. There were 4 or 5 of us women in that house, and Lazarus's sisters, and we ate our own meal and told the story as it must be told. And it was a good evening, and I want to place it here because of what came next. Lamplight, bitter herbs. The youngest one in the house asking the question, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" in a piping voice, badly, twice, because she got it wrong the first time and everybody laughed and made her do it again. Why is this night different from all other nights? Then bed, and I slept. And I have never forgiven myself for that, which is unreasonable of me. I slept well. Somewhere over the hill, in an olive grove I knew, on ground I had sat on, he was going through something I cannot imagine, alone, while 3 men who loved him could not keep their eyes open. And 2 miles off, I was asleep with my cloak over my shoulder, like a woman with nothing on her mind. The news came up the hill in pieces during the night, the way bad news always does, each piece worse, and none of them complete. Somebody was hammering on the door, and it was still full dark. A boy from the city, one of the household of the house with the upper room, and he was so out of breath he could not get it out. They had taken him in the garden. Soldiers, and temple police, and torches. He had gone with them, without a struggle. One of ours had cut somebody, and had been made to stop. And Judas. I will say almost nothing about Judas, because everything I could say would be guessing, and because there has been so much said by people who never sat next to him. He kept our money, and he kept it honestly for 2.5 years, as far as I ever saw. He was clever, and he was tightly wound, and he wanted something to happen. I think he wanted to force it. I think he could not bear the waiting either. And he did something to make the hour come, and the hour came, and it was not the hour he had imagined. That is all I have. I cannot know what was in his heart, and I have stopped trying to. He was a man at our fire. I have never been able to make him into a devil, and God knows I tried for a while, because it would have been easier. We went down into the city before dawn, all of us. Nobody suggested staying. I remember that walk more clearly than almost anything. Down the Bethany Road in the dark, with the Kidron Valley on our left, and the great mass of the temple platform above us on the other side, dark against a sky that was just beginning to go grey at the edge. Cold. Jerusalem is high, and the nights in that season are properly cold, and I had my cloak over my head, and my hands inside it. Nobody spoke. Somebody was praying under her breath the whole way. The same line over and over. The city was awake. That was the strangest part. It was an ordinary preparation day for 100,000 people. The markets were setting up. The lambs were being taken through the streets. There was smoke and shouting and children underfoot, everybody busy with the feast. The world does not stop. It is one of the things I most want to warn people about, and there is no way to prepare anyone for it. On the worst day of your life, the bread still gets baked in the next street, and someone is having a good morning. We found the others near the high priest's house. Not all of them. Not most of them, in fact. And here is where I have to say the hardest thing about that night, and I want to say it without any judgment at all, because I have thought about it for a very long time, and I have come out somewhere kind. They ran. Every one of them. When the torches came into the garden, they ran into the trees and the dark and away. And then, in ones and twos, ashamed, they crept back into the city and stood at the edges with their hoods up. Peter got closer than any of them. Peter followed right into the courtyard of the high priest's house, and stood at the fire with the servants and the guards, warming his hands, which took a kind of courage that the others did not have that night. And then a girl, a serving girl. Nobody, someone's kitchen maid, looked at him across the fire and said, "You were with him?" And he said no, 3 times. The last time, they said, with cursing, the way a Galilean fisherman swears when he wants a conversation over. And then the cock crowed, and he remembered something that had been said to him at supper, and he went out of that courtyard, and was not seen for a day and a half. I have heard people be very hard on Peter. I have never been able to join in. I know exactly what happened to him, because it is what happens to everybody, and it is not cowardice, it is arithmetic. Something in you does a sum in the dark. If I say yes, they take me too. And then what use am I to him? And the sum is wrong. And you know it is wrong even while you are doing it, and you say the word anyway. And then you have to live with having heard your own voice say it. I will tell you the thing that has kept me steady for the rest of my life on this. When it was all over, much later, on a beach, with a fire, he did not make Peter apologize. Not once. He asked him 3 times whether he loved him, once for each denial, and gave him work to do. That is what he did with our worst nights. He did not extract confessions. He gave people something to carry, but that was later. On that morning, we did not know that anything came later. On that morning, we stood in a street outside a rich man's house in the cold with our hoods up, listening to the shouting from inside the courtyard and we could not get in, and we could not do anything at all. They took him to Pilate at first light, because they had no authority to do what they intended to do, and Pilate did. The governor's place had a raised pavement out at the front where he could sit in the open and be seen to judge, because Rome liked to be seen to judge. There was a crowd. There was always a crowd there in the mornings. At feast time, it was worse, and we were in it, well back at the edge, holding on to each other's sleeves so as not to be separated. I could not see. I want to be truthful about what I actually witnessed. For most of that morning, I saw the backs of men's heads and a strip of sky, and occasionally, when the crowd moved, a piece of the pavement in the shape of somebody standing on it. So I heard it, rather than saw it, and hearing was worse. I heard the crowd change. That is the thing I have never been able to explain to anyone who was not there. A crowd is a living thing with a mood, and you can feel it in the ground and in your own chest, and I felt it turn. It went from curiosity, a low, restless, interested hum, to something with an edge on it, and then to something I'd never stood inside before, and have never stood inside since, thank God. There was chanting. It got hold of the whole square, the way chanting does, and people who had walked into that square with no opinion at all were shouting inside a minute, because it is easier to shout with everyone than to stand silent among them. I saw a man near me start shouting, who had been eating bread 30 seconds earlier. I do not think he could have told you what he wanted. He wanted to be with everybody. That is what I learned in that square. And it is the ugliest thing I know. It is not that the world is full of cruel people. There were not 5,000 cruel people in Jerusalem that morning. There were a few dozen who had decided, and a few hundred who had been organized, and several thousand who did not want to be the odd one out. That is all it ever takes. Pilate did not want to do it. Even from the back of a crowd you could tell. He came out 3 or 4 times. He tried things. He sent him off to Herod at one point, which took the better part of an hour and achieved nothing. He offered them a choice and got the wrong answer. He brought him out at one stage in a purple cloak with something on his head, which was meant, I think, as a piece of theater to make the whole thing look small enough to let go. And I heard him say, "Behold the man. Behold the man." He said it to shame them into stopping. It did not work. They shouted him down. And in the end, Pilate did what men in that position always do, which was to decide that his own position was worth more than a Galilean's life. And he said the words, and it was done. And I heard the sound the crowd made when it got what it wanted. I would like to never hear that sound again. Now, the next part. They flogged him first, because that was the practice. I was not able to see it, and I would not describe it if I had been. Some things do not need to be given to you in detail for you to understand them. If you have ever nursed anybody, ever held anyone's hand through anything, you already know more than enough about what a body can be made to bear. I will simply say that when they brought him out to take him up to the hill, he could not carry the beam. He had carried it out of the gate. Then he was down on the stones, and there was a delay, and the soldiers pulled a man out of the crowd to carry it for him, an African, a pilgrim, a man called Simon, who had come a very long way to keep a feast, and instead got that. I have often wondered about him too. I hope somebody thanked him. His sons were known among us later, so I think somebody did. And that is when I saw him properly for the first time that day. They came past us, out through the gate and up the road, and the crowd was pressed back either side, and he went by close enough that I could have reached him. I am not going to describe his face. I have decided this deliberately, and I have never once regretted it. There are people who will tell you every detail of what they saw on that road, and I understand the impulse. They think that the horror is the point, that if you do not feel the horror, you have not understood. But I knew that face. I had watched it laugh at its own jokes and go still at a child's question and fall asleep against a wall. It is the only face I have ever loved without complication. And what they had done to it was not the truth about it. So I will tell you the small thing instead. As he went past, some women near the front were wailing. The professional kind of wailing and the ordinary kind, all mixed, and he stopped. In the middle of that, with the beam on another man's back, he stopped and said something to them. He told them not to weep for him. He told them to weep for themselves and for their children, because of what he could see coming for that city. Even then, even on that road, with everything, his mind went outward to somebody else's future. Then they took him up. Golgotha is not a mountain. Everyone imagines a mountain. It was a low knuckle of rock just outside the wall, beside the main road, so that people going in and out of the city would see. That was the point of it. It was a piece of public information, cited where the traffic was. I'm going to give you this hour the way I actually have it, which is in pieces, and quietly. I remember the sound of the hammering. It went on longer than you would think, and there was an echo off the rock face. I remember the crowd noise dropping right away after that, because the crucifixion is not interesting to watch. It is only terrible, and it is slow, and most people drift off after the first hour. I remember that the soldiers sat down. There were 4 of them on our man, and they sat down on the ground with their backs to the whole thing and got out dice, and they gambled for his clothes. And one of them was arguing about the tunic because it was seamless and cutting it up would spoil it. I listened to a soldier explain to another soldier that it would be a shame to spoil a good tunic. I remember there was a notice board nailed above him with the charge written on it in 3 languages, and that the wording had annoyed the priests, and that they had gone to Pilate about it, and that Pilate had said no. What I have written, I have written. Of all the things to be stubborn about. I remember the flies, and I remember standing. That is the main thing I have from those hours. Standing. We stood. We were not able to do anything else, and we did not sit down. Mary, his mother, was next to me, and her sister, and the other Mary, the wife of Clopas. Somewhere in the first hour, John came and stood with us, and he was the only one of the men. Nobody spoke for a long time. There was nothing to say, and no comfort to give. That would not have been an insult. I have found this to be true at every deathbed I have been at since, and there have been a good few. There comes a point where words are simply out of scale. You stand, you stay. That is the whole of your job, and it is much harder than it sounds, and the doing of it is not nothing. I want to say that clearly, because there will be people listening to this who have stood by a bed for hours feeling utterly useless. You were not useless. Being there is the thing. Presence is not a lesser form of help. It is the older, deeper one. The mother did not make a sound. That is the detail I have never been able to get out of my mind, and the one I have never seen painted properly. People imagine her collapsed. She stood. She stood for hours, straight, with her hands at her sides, and looked at her son, and did not once look away. And I understood, watching her, that she was doing the last thing left that a mother could do for a child, which is to make certain that he was not alone in it. If he could see anything from up there, he could see her. That was her gift, and it cost her everything, and she paid it standing up. He spoke a few times, not many. It is very hard to speak in that position. You have to push yourself up to get the breath, and so every word is bought. He spoke about the soldiers. He asked that they be forgiven, because they did not know what they were doing. The 4 with the dice. I looked at them when he said it, and they did not react at all. And I remember a kind of white rage going through me, and I remember it passing, and I've never been able to get it back since. I have tried. Once you have heard that said over them, you cannot get the rage to stay lit. He spoke to one of the other two, who was also dying, and who had said something to him. He promised him something. Paradise. That day. I heard it, and it made no sense to me at all. A man with nothing left to give, giving away a kingdom. And then, in the middle of it, he looked at us. He looked down at his mother, and at John standing beside her, and he said, "To her, woman, behold your son." And to John, "Behold your mother." He was arranging her care. That is the moment I would take with me, if I could take only one. Not the great sayings. That, in the middle of the worst hour any human being has ever had, a dying man's mind went to the practical problem of who was going to look after his mother now, and he solved it out loud in 9 words. Because she would have had nothing. A widow with no son is a woman with no roof in that world. He was making sure she had a roof. Everything I ever believed about him, I believe because of those 9 words. Anybody can be lofty at the end. He was useful at the end. Then the dark came. I do not know what it was. I have heard every explanation, and I have no interest in any of them. It came in the middle of the day, and it was not a cloud, and it was not an eclipse, and it lasted about 3 hours, and it was not the black of night, but a heavy, brownish, wrong-colored dusk, like the light before a storm that never breaks. The birds went quiet. Somebody's donkey down on the road would not stop making a noise. The soldiers stopped their game and stood up, and in that long brown afternoon, everything went very quiet and very slow, and I could hear him breathing. That is the memory, not screaming, breathing. The long, dreadful, patient work of it. I stood in the half-dark and listened to a man breathe for 3 hours, and I have listened to a good many people breathe like that since, in rooms with the lamp low, and every single time I have been back on that hill. Near the end he cried out, one line, out of a psalm, the one that asks God why he has been abandoned. I have heard learned people argue about that line for years, about what it meant, about whether he was quoting the whole psalm which ends in triumph, and I am sure all of that is worth discussing. I only know what it was to hear it. It was a man who had spent his whole life saying Father, asking where he had gone. If you have ever been in a place so dark that you could not feel God in it at all, and thought that this meant you had failed, I would like you to hold on to that line tonight. He was there, too. He got there before you. Then he said he was thirsty, and one of the soldiers, and I've never known why, took the trouble to soak a sponge in the sour wine they had for themselves and hold it up on a stalk of hyssop so he could drink. A small mercy from a man who had gambled for his clothes at noon. People are not one thing. And then he said, "It is finished." Not a groan. It came out clearly, and it did not sound like defeat. And I have never been able to make it sound like defeat, though everything I could see said otherwise. It sounded like a man putting down a tool at the end of a day's work. Then he said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And his head went down, and the breathing stopped. Here is what I want you to have from that moment. Silence. Complete, sudden, physical silence in the middle of the afternoon under a brown sky. I had been listening to that breath so hard for so long that when it stopped, the quiet came down like something falling. The whole hill heard it stop. The centurion, the officer commanding, a professional, a man who had certainly done this 100 times, said out loud to nobody that this man had been the Son of God. And the crowd that was left began to go home. hitting their chests the way people do, and the soldiers began the business of clearing up. And I stood exactly where I was and could not move at all, and the earth was under my feet, and there was nothing in me but a kind of enormous flat silence. And I thought, the room is empty again. There was a great hurry after that, and I was glad of it. There is a mercy in there being things to do. It was preparation day, and the Sabbath began at sunset, and that Sabbath was a high one, the Passover Sabbath, and nothing could be left hanging on the road into a holy day. So there were perhaps 2 hours. The priests sent to Pilate to have it hastened for all 3, which was done in the usual way for the other 2, and I will not tell you about that. When they came to him, they did not need to, because he was already gone, and one of them made sure of it with a spear, and there was blood and water, and John saw it, and never forgot it, and wrote it down years later because it mattered to him. And then, extraordinarily, there was Joseph. None of us knew him. He was a member of the council, the same council that had sat all night to arrange this. A rich man from Arimathea. And it turned out he had been a disciple secretly for some time, and had not consented to what they did, and had said nothing about it in the chamber, and was ashamed. And that afternoon, with the body still hanging on a public road, he walked into the governor's residence and asked for it. I have thought about the courage of that so many times. Everything he had, position, safety, the good opinion of every man he worked with, he spent in a single afternoon, and he spent it on a corpse. There was no advantage in it. The man was dead. There was nothing left to gain, and no one to impress. Some people are brave in the wrong order. They are quiet when they should have spoken. And then, when it is far too late to make any difference at all, they do the bravest thing anyone does that day. I have never once thought less of him for being late. He came, and Nicodemus came with him, the one who had come to talk in the night once, years before, because he could not be seen to come by day. He brought spices. He brought an absurd amount, myrrh and aloes, 70 pounds of it, a quantity you would use for a king. And I remember 2 servants staggering up the road under it, and the sheer, ridiculous, magnificent excess of it made me want to weep more than anything else that day. He could not stand up in the council, so he bought 70 pounds of myrrh. We took him down together as the light was going. I will not describe it. I will tell you only that it took several of us, and that we were careful, and that his mother had him for a little while. I have wondered whether to include that, and I have decided to, because there will be people listening who have washed and dressed someone they loved. It is one of the oldest kindnesses there is, and it does not feel like a kindness while you are doing it. It feels like the last chore of a long illness, and your hands do it while you stand somewhere outside yourself and watch them. And afterwards, it is one of the things you are most glad of. I am glad of it. I was there, and my hands were useful, and I did the last thing. The tomb was Joseph's own. That is the other extraordinary detail. A man's own new tomb, cut in the rock, never used, which he had made for himself as rich men do, and he gave it away that evening without appearing to think about it. It was close. There was a garden right beside the place where they had crucified him, a walled plot with olives and something in flower, a rich man's garden, quiet, with a path, and the tomb was cut into the rock at the side of it. That is a strange thing to say about that day, but I want you to have it. We carried him about 100 paces from the worst place on earth into a garden. The smell changed. You came in off that road, and there was the green smell of a watered place in the evening. We laid him in the linen with the spices, as our custom is. Joseph had bought the cloth new, and we had almost no time. I want that understood, because it is the whole reason for everything that happened afterwards. We did what could be done in perhaps a quarter of an hour, with the sun going down and the horns beginning to sound over the wall for the Sabbath. It was not enough. It was a rushed job on a borrowed grave. The proper thing, the thing a woman owes the dead, could not be done. And I stood in the doorway of that tomb and looked at what we had managed, and I thought, quite coldly and clearly, I will come back and finish this. That thought is the reason I was in the garden on the third day, not faith. I want to be completely honest with you about that, because I think it matters. I did not go back on the third day because I believed anything. I went back because the linen had been wound badly, and the spices were not properly laid, and there was a woman's job left undone, and I could not bear it. God, as far as I can tell, does not seem to mind what gets you to the garden. He only minds that you come. They rolled the stone across. It was a disc of rock in a channel, and it took the men leaning on it together, and it went over with a grinding sound, and then a knock at the end that I felt in my feet. Then the men left, and the other Mary and I sat down on the ground opposite the tomb. We did not talk. We sat and watched the door of it, the way you might sit with a sleeping child you are frightened to leave, and the light went orange and then grey and then blue, and the first stars came out over the wall of the garden, and somewhere in the city they were singing because it was the feast. We sat there until it was fully dark. And then, because it was the Sabbath, and because that is what you do, we got up and went back to the house. Nobody talks about the Saturday. There are 1,000 accounts of the Friday, and 1,000 of the Sunday, and almost nothing about the day in between. And I understand why. Nothing happened. That is precisely the point. Nothing happened for one entire day. And if you want to know where most of a human life is actually lived, it is in that day. We kept the Sabbath. Of course we did. It never occurred to any of us not. That is what people who have not lived inside that law never quite grasp. We did not rest because we felt like resting. We rested because the day said rest, and the day did not care what had happened on Friday, and there was something in the sheer indifference of the commandment that held us up. Some scaffolding stays standing when everything inside it has fallen. You do the thing you have always done at that hour, because it is that hour. So we sat in a house in Jerusalem for a day and did not work. It was a long room with a low ceiling and 2 windows, and the men were there, most of them, having come back one at a time through the night with their hoods up. The door was barred. That is the detail I would give you if you want to know what the mood was. The door was barred all day on the Sabbath in a house full of pilgrims because we were expecting soldiers. I do not remember much conversation. I remember Peter sitting against the wall with his forearms on his knees, not speaking to anybody for hours. I remember somebody crying at intervals through the morning, and everybody letting them. I remember an argument starting up in the afternoon about whether we should leave for Galilee that night, or wait, and it went on a while and got sharp, and then it just stopped, because it did not matter, because none of it mattered, and everybody in the room understood at the same moment that we had no reason to go anywhere ever again. That was the flavor of it. Not grief. Exactly. Not yet. Grief comes later, and it is hot. This was cold. It was the flat, grey, low-tide feeling of a thing being over, and underneath it, in me, something worse, which I will tell you because I suspect somebody listening needs to hear it said out loud. I thought I had been wrong about everything, not just about him, about myself. Because here is what 3 years had done. I had built a whole new person on top of that morning on the beach. Everything I was. The woman who traveled, who was trusted, who could handle a village and mend a sandal and sit up all night with a stranger's fever. All of it was built on the fact that he had looked at me and seen somebody worth calling out of that noise. And if he was wrong, or a fraud, or simply a good man who had misjudged the danger of a city, then what was I standing on? I sat in that room on that Sabbath and thought, the 7 will come back. I want to be careful here. They did not. Nothing came back. Then, or ever. But I sat there in the grey light and was certain that they would, because I could not see any reason left for them to stay away, and the fear of it was worse than the grief. I could not tell anyone. Every single person in that room was carrying something they could not say out loud. That is what the Saturday is. And I have met a great many people since who are living in it, who had something once or someone, and now have a barred door and a long room, and a day that will not end, and I have never had anything clever to say to them. I will not pretend to now. What I can tell you is what we did, because it turned out to matter. When the sun went down, and the Sabbath ended, and the lamps were lit, and it became lawful to work again, 3 of us got up and went out and bought spices. The shops open the moment the first star shows. The streets were full of people buying oil and flour and getting on with things. And we went out into that with a purse and bought myrrh and aloes and a jar of ointment. And we brought them back and sat on the floor of that room and prepared them by lamplight while everyone else lay along the walls trying to sleep. It took hours. It is not quick work. You have to grind and mix and warm it, and you get the smell of it deep into your hands, and it will not wash out for days. Nobody helped us, and nobody stopped us. Peter watched from the wall for a while and said nothing. I think everyone in that room understood that this was not really about the spices, because look at what we were doing. It was pointless. Anyone could have told us. He had been in a sealed rock tomb since Friday evening in a warm country, and there was a stone across the door that 3 men had struggled to move. We had discussed that, actually, in the middle of the grinding. One of the others said, "Who is going to roll away the stone for us?" And we all sat there for a moment and then went on grinding, because we had no answer and we were going anyway. That is the truest thing about my whole life. That hour, we went on grinding. You will not always have faith. There will be nights when you have absolutely nothing. When the door is barred and the room is grey, and you are fairly sure you were wrong about everything you built your life on. And on those nights, you may still be able to do the next small, useful thing in front of you. Grind the spices. Fold the linen. Feed somebody. Turn up. It is not faith. It is much smaller than faith, but it will carry you to the morning. And that is all anything has to do. I slept 2 or 3 hours on that floor with my head on my folded cloak and the smell of myrrh all over my hands. And then, a long time before there was any light, I opened my eyes in the dark, and I was completely awake, and everybody else in that room was asleep. So I got up quietly, and I found the jar, and I went out. It was still dark. That is how it was written down afterwards. And it is exactly right, and I've always been glad they kept it in. Not the grey before dawn, before that. The hour when the last of the lamps have gone out, and the first of the bakers have not yet started, and the city is as close to silent as a city ever gets. I have never in my life been anywhere quieter than Jerusalem. In that hour, I went out with the other Mary and one more, and we did not talk. We went down through the streets with the jar wrapped in cloth against my chest, and the stones were cold through my sandals, and there was a smell of wet dust and old smoke and old unexpectedly, somebody's jasmine over a wall. Let me slow this right down, because we have come a long way, and there is no need to hurry now. Nothing that happens from here on will be frightening. We went out by the gate on the northwest side, which the guard opened without much interest because women going out before dawn to a grave is the most ordinary thing in the world. And then we were on the road, and the road was empty, and the sky over the eastern hills had just begun to go from black to something that was not quite black. I could hear our feet. I could hear the jar tap once against a bracelet on my wrist. There were birds beginning, a very long way off. One bird, actually, and then a pause, and then another answering it, which is how it always starts. Somewhere behind us in the dark, a dog barked twice and stopped. I remember thinking about the stone and deciding not to think about the stone. We would get there and there would be a stone, and we would sit down in front of it and wait until somebody came who could move it, and if nobody came, we would sit there all day. That was the plan. It was not a good plan. It was the only one available, and having any plan at all was the point. I remember, too, that I was rehearsing. That is such an odd thing to admit, and I've never told anyone. As I walked, I was going over what I would do when I got in there. The order of it. Unwind. This far and no further. Take the headcloth off last. Do the hands first. Because the hands were what I most wanted to touch. I had had his hand on the side of my head once, on wet shingle, and I had never told him what it had done. And I was going to do this instead, and it was going to have to serve. That is what I was carrying up that road. Not hope. A list. A woman's list of small things to be done properly. The garden gate was open. I noticed that, and thought nothing of it. The path in was pale, and I could see it well enough, and there were the olives on the left with their leaves going about their business in the dark, and the flowering thing whose name I never asked, and the whole plot smelled green and cool and slightly of turned earth, because gardens are watered before dawn in that country, and somebody's gardener had been through. And then I came round the corner of the rock, and I stopped. The stone was open, not broken, not smashed, rolled back in its channel, all the way, and the doorway of the tomb standing black and square in the rock face, and nobody there. I want to tell you the truth about what I felt, and the truth has nothing lovely in it. I did not think he is risen. That thought was not available to me. It was not in the stock of thoughts I owned. What I felt was the floor going out, because there is only one thing an open grave means. It means someone has been. And I stood there in that garden in the dark, with a jar of myrrh in my arms, and I understood, with a completeness that I can still feel in my chest, that they had not even left us this, that the last thing on earth I had, a door, a place, 100 paces of garden where I could come and do a job properly, had been taken in the night as well. I have been asked whether I was frightened. No, I was past frightened. There is a state beyond fear where everything goes very clear and very cold, and you become extremely practical, and I went straight into it. I put the jar down on the ground, carefully. I remember being careful with it, which is absurd. And then I said something to the others, and I turned round and ran. I ran the whole way back, down the path, out of the gate, along the road, in through the city gate past a guard who shouted something after me, up through the streets in the dark. I have never run like that before or since. I was 30-odd years old, and I had walked half of Galilee. And even so, by the time I got to that door, I could not speak. I hammered on it, and someone unbarred it, and I got the words out in the wrong order. They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. We, not I. Even then, and the Lord, and they. I did not know who they were, and I still do not. The priests, The soldiers, Joseph's servants. The gardener, somebody. Grave robbers even, though there was nothing in there to rob. Peter went past me out of that door with his cloak in his hand, and John went past him. They ran. I went after them, and I could not keep up because I had already run it once, and I remember that quite clearly, being left behind on that road, watching the two of them go away up the hill in the half-light, and hearing my own breathing. By the time I got back into the garden, they had already been in. John got there first, because he was younger and he ran better, and he had stopped at the doorway and looked in and not gone in, and Peter, who was Peter, arrived second and went straight past him and inside. The linen was there. That is what they found. The cloths lying where the body had been, and the cloth that had been round the head not thrown down with them but rolled and set aside in its own place by itself. And that detail is the reason John came out of that tomb a different man from the one who went in. He told me later what he had thought. Standing there, he said, "Robbers do not tidy." He believed it in that moment. He did not understand it. He says himself that he did not, that none of us yet knew the scriptures about this, but something in him turned over at the sight of a folded cloth and never turned back. And then they left. I have never entirely got over that, and I say it with love, because they were my friends, and one of them wrote it all down honestly, including this. They looked, and they saw, and then they went back to the house. They went home. They had things to think about, and people to tell, and nowhere in the world felt safe, and I understand it perfectly. But they went, and I stayed. So then there was just me. Everybody else had gone. The others had gone back with the men, and the garden was empty, and the sky over the eastern wall had gone from not quite black to grey, and there was enough light now to see colour in things. The green of the olives coming back, the pale of the path, the red of the flowering thing by the wall. And I stood outside the tomb and cried, not in a dignified way. I had held it for 3 days, all through the standing and the taking down and the barred room and the grinding of the spices, and it came out of me in that garden with nobody there to see it, and I let it, because there was no longer any reason not to. I want to stay here a moment in this exact place, because this is the low point of my whole life and something happens next, and I want you to feel the distance between the two. I had nothing. Let me count it out. He was dead. That was 3 days established. Everything I had built myself out of was gone with him, and I was fairly sure that the woman I had been for 3 years had been a kind of borrowed coat that would now be taken back. His body was gone too, which meant that even the small mercy of a last useful task had been removed. I could not do the one thing I had come to do. The jar was sitting on the ground behind me, ground and mixed and warmed by hand over 4 hours in a barred room, and there was nothing to put it on. And I was alone in a garden before sunrise, and everyone who loved him had gone somewhere else. That is the bottom. I have been at the bottom twice in my life. Once on the shingle at Magdala, and once on the path in that garden, and I want to point out something about both of them, which I did not notice at the time, and have never stopped noticing since. Both times I was already being come to. The coming had already started. It had started before I knew anything about it, and my despair was, from the point of view of the thing that was actually happening, out of date. On the beach, he was already walking up the shingle, while I was still on the stones. And in the garden, well, I stooped down and looked into the tomb. I do not know why. I had been told what was in there, and I had 2 witnesses, and there was no reason. I bent down and put my head into that low doorway and looked, the way you check a room you have already checked, and there were 2 of them, sitting there, in white, one where his head had been, and one where his feet had been. I know how this ought to have gone. There is a proper way to react to angels, and the whole of our scripture agrees on it. You fall down, you cover your face, you are terrified. Everybody in the whole of the story, from Abraham on, is terrified. I was not terrified. I have thought about this more than almost anything else, and the only honest explanation I have is that I was so far past the end of myself that there was nothing left to be frightened with. You can only be afraid if you still have something to lose. They asked me a question. They said, "Woman, why are you weeping?" Which is, if you stop and look at it, an extraordinary thing to ask a woman crying at a grave. It is the least necessary question in history. Two shining beings, sitting in an empty tomb, asking a sobbing woman what she is upset about. And I answered it flatly, the way you answer a stupid question when you have not slept. I said, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." My Lord. I noticed that now. Not the Lord, which is what I had said at the door in the dark. Alone in the garden. To the angels, it came out as my. Then I straightened up and turned round, because there was nothing there for me either, and I was going to go. And there was a man standing on the path. I did not look at him properly. I want to be honest about how ordinary this was. The light was still grey, and I had been crying so hard that I could not have identified my own mother at 10 paces, and I had my head down, and my one thought was the gardener. Somebody who works here. Somebody who will know. Because of course, there is a man in a garden before dawn. Somebody had watered that path. He said, "Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for?" The same question. The identical question, asked a second time, and I've come to think that this is the kindest thing in the whole of my story, that nobody in that garden told me to stop crying. Not the angels, and not him. Twice I was asked why, which is an invitation to say it out loud, and both times I got to say it, and nobody was in a hurry, and I said the sentence I had been saying all morning, which had by then worn a groove in me like the rope on the well at Magdala. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Listen to that. I will take him away. Me. One woman. No cart, no help, with a jar on the ground and a bad night behind her, offering to carry a grown man's body out of a garden on her own. That is what I had left. It was not much, and it was not sensible, and it was, I think, the most loving sentence I ever said in my life. He said my name. That is all that happened. I want to be exact, because everything I am and everything I have done since comes out of one word spoken in a garden at dawn. He did not explain. He did not announce anything, or open the heavens, or say, "Behold." He said, "Mary," and I knew. I knew before I turned. I knew before I lifted my head. Because there is a particular way that your own name sounds in the mouth of the one person who has never once said it wrongly, and I had heard it that way exactly once before, lying on wet shingle at the edge of a lake with the sound of small waves and an empty room in my head, and I had spent 3 years waiting for it, and one day believing I would never hear it again. Nobody says your name like that, twice by accident. I turned round. I have had a long time to try to describe what he looked like, and I cannot do it, and I have stopped apologizing for that. He was himself, not a spirit. I want to say that plainly, because it was the first question everybody asked me, and they asked it for years. Not a light, or a vision, or a shape in the mist. He was standing on a garden path in the early morning with his feet on the ground, and he was more solidly there than I was. And he was well. That is what I could not get over. in the first moment and for weeks afterwards. He was well, whole, rested, not repaired, not patched, not merely surviving. Well in the way that a person is well, when they have slept properly for the first time in years, and woken in the light, and lain still for a while in case it breaks. I knew that wellness. I had had it given to me on a beach. I said one word back. Rabboni, teacher. It is our word, the intimate one, the one you use for the one who taught you, and it came out of me in Aramaic because that was the language everything true in me happened in. And then I took hold of him. I did. Immediately, without any thought at all. The way you take hold of a child who has run into a road, the way you grab the side of a boat. I had my hands on him, and I was not going to let go, and I do not remember deciding to do it. He said, "Do not hold me." I have heard that translated coldly for years, "touch me not," and it has hurt me every time I have heard it said that way, because that is not what it was. It was not a rebuke. He did not step back. It was, I promise you, closer to what you say to someone hugging you in a doorway when there is somewhere you both have to be. Don't hold on. Not yet. There is something I need you to do. He said he had not yet gone up to his father. And then he said, "Go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Go and tell." Do you understand what he did there? I need to say this carefully, because it is the part of my life that I am proudest of, and the part I had least to do with. He was risen from the dead, perhaps an hour, perhaps less. The single most important thing that has ever happened had just happened, and it was, for one short while, a secret known to nobody in the world. And he had to choose who to give it to. Anybody. Any one of the 11. The council. The governor. His own mother. And God knows she had earned it. He chose the woman who had been out of her mind. He chose the one who had been sitting among the tombs at Magdala, with her back to the cold stone, asking a thing that could not answer what it wanted. He put the first news of the resurrection into the hands of a woman whose testimony would not have been accepted in any court in the country, and he sent her to the men. And he did not give me a sign to carry, or a proof, or anything I could show them. He gave me a sentence, and my own face, and he sent me with that. I have thought about it every day of my life since. I think it was on purpose. I think it was the whole shape of him. The same thing he had been doing in every village in Galilee for 3 years, going always first to the one nobody would have picked. My Father and your Father. My God and your God. That is the other thing in that sentence. And I nearly missed it at the time. He was not going back up alone. Whatever had opened, it had opened for us as well. I let go of him. That is the last physical thing I remember, taking my hands off him, which was the hardest small act of my life, and standing back on that path. I do not know how long we were there. I have no idea. The light changed while we were talking. It must have, because when I came to leave, the sun was properly up over the eastern wall, and the whole garden had color in it, the olives silver and the path gold, and the flowering thing by the wall blazing away, and there were birds going at it now in earnest, all of them at once, the way they do about 10 minutes after sunrise. And I want to leave you with this, because it is the picture I have carried for the rest of my life, and I would like you to have it as you go to sleep. A garden, early, the dew still on everything, and the light coming in low and yellow across the wall. An open tomb behind me with the linen folded inside it. A jar of myrrh sitting on the ground by the path where I had put it down, still full, never used and never needed. And 2 people standing on a path, talking, in the morning. I ran again. My third run of that morning. Out of the garden gate, and down the road, and in through the city gate. And this time the city was awake. The bakers were going. The streets had people in them. Somebody was driving goats through a gap that was not wide enough for goats. And I went through all of that with my hair coming down, and my face wet, and nobody looked twice, because Jerusalem after a feast is full of people behaving oddly. I do not remember the streets. I remember the sentence. I had it going round and round the whole way, the way you carry a sentence you are frightened of dropping. I got to the door, and it was barred, and I hit it with the flat of my hand and said my name, and it opened, and I stood in that long low room with all of them looking at me, Peter against the wall, John, the others, the women, everybody who had been sitting in the grey for a day and a half, and I said, I have seen the Lord. And then I told them what he had said to me, word for word, exactly as it had been given to me. They did not believe me. I have never minded that, as much as people expect. It has been written down honestly in more than one account that we told them, and the word seemed to them to be nonsense, and they did not believe us. And I am glad it was written down, for two reasons. The first is that it is true, and if you are going to build anything on a story, it had better be a story that admits what actually happened in the room. The second is more personal. Nobody believing me is the reason I know I did not invent it. If grief had made him for me, grief would have made him in the shape I wanted, and I knew exactly what I wanted, because I had carried it up that road in a jar. I wanted him lying still in the tomb, with the linen wound properly, and the spices laid the way they should have been laid, and my hands finishing the job. That is what I went out for. What I was given instead was a living man on a path, telling me not to hold on to him, sending me to 11 frightened men who would tell me I was talking nonsense. Nobody dreams that. It was not shaped like anything anybody expected, which is precisely why they did not believe a word of it. Peter got up and went again. He could not help it. He ran back to that tomb a second time, and looked in at the linen a second time, and came home again with nothing, wondering, and I loved him for it. They believed by the evening, most of them, because by the evening he had come and stood in the middle of that room with the doors still locked, and said, "Peace be to you," and shown them his hands. But for a few hours in the middle of that morning, I was the only person alive who knew. And I had already learned, on a beach, in a town by a lake, that it does not matter very much whether the town believes you. What matters is whether you can hear your own voice in the room. Now, I have nearly finished, and I want to end where we started, and gently, because you should be nearly asleep by now. I lived a long time after that, longer than most of them, I think. There was a great deal of work and a good deal of trouble, and it went on for years, and none of that is this story. But here is what I want to leave with you, and it is only 3 things, and then I will stop. The first is this. I have been called many things in my life: mad, unclean, finished, a liar, a woman whose testimony does not count, and latterly other things by people trying to be kind. I have answered to one name. He said Mary on the shingle when I could not find myself, and he said Mary in the garden when I could not find him, and everything in between was the walk from one to the other. If you take one thing from tonight, take this, whatever else you have been called. There is a name of yours that is spoken correctly, even if you cannot hear it at the moment, especially then. The second, nothing I did got me to that garden. I want that on the record, because people have made me into something devout, and I was not devout, not that morning. I went out before dawn with a jar, because there was a job half done, and it offended me. I went out of stubbornness and habit and love and a refusal to leave the linen badly wound, and every single one of those is a smaller thing than faith, and every single one of them was enough. Do the next small, useful thing. It is a road, and it goes somewhere, and you do not have to be able to see the end of it. And the third, and then I will let you sleep. He came at dawn, not at midnight, when it was most dramatic, not on the Friday, when it would have saved everybody a great deal of pain. He came in the grey, at the very end of the longest night there has ever been, when everyone who loved him had given up and gone home, and one woman was standing on a path with nothing left, crying at an empty hole in a rock. That is the hour he chose. He has, as far as I can tell, always liked that hour. So if you are lying in the dark now, at the end of your own long night, if there is something you are carrying that has not been made right yet, if the room in you is loud, if the stone in front of you is far too big, and you have already worked out that there is nobody to move it, then I will tell you what I know, which is not very much, and all of it first-hand. The stone was already moved before I got there. It was moved while I was still asleep on the floor of a barred room, being certain I'd been wrong about everything. And the last thing I heard before the sun came up over the wall of that garden was somebody saying my name, kindly, in the dark, as though it were the easiest thing in the world to find me. Sleep, now. The light comes in low and yellow over the wall, and the birds start about 10 minutes after, all at once. He is not in the tomb. The linen is folded, and the garden is full of mourning. This has been the Shepherd's Bible.